When it comes to the triple bottom line, people, planet, profit, businesses are forced to contend with diversity under people, relationships, fair relationships with its workforce and its consumers. And of course, consumers are often driving a business's fairness efforts in relation to its workers because people are more transparent. And when there's inequality or unfairness at work, certainly social media has become one of those areas for whistleblowers to spread the word. I'll come to some examples of this as we look through how gender is portrayed in popular culture, because we're also talking about the role of culture in pushing and driving as a social factor in the pestle framework, the framework of how businesses might think of their macro environment. For an earlier article that we looked at in The Economist about Dannon becoming a B Corp and looking at strengthening its people, planet, profit as a bottom line versus just profit, we know that in addition to looking at fairness in its workers, its suppliers, that gender and diversity will eventually come up. So what's the problem with gender and diversity today? Well, according to the Gender Pay Gap Reporting Deadline Briefing of April 2018 that was put up on the Fawcett Society, all organizations in the UK with over 250 employees are legally required to have published their gender pay gap data in the run-up to the deadline. Many employers by that time that this advocate organization published its policy briefing had not done so. Who is the Fawcett Society? Well, they are an advocacy society that raised awareness about the gender pay gap, and they were so successful that eventually there became a law that companies must do an audit of the gender pay gap and report this data. And so this policy briefing is informing the public of the progress of the company's reporting. Now, just to be clear, what is the gender pay gap? Because that's different from equal pay. So according to the report, gender pay gap refers to the average difference in pay per hour between a particular group of men and women, for example, in a particular business, industry, or country. Equal pay, however, refers to the legal right for a woman to be paid the same as a man for the same work or work of the same value. In other words, not to be discriminated against. And discrimination, of course, is one of the several reasons for the unequal pay across genders. And that's what we're focusing on, not the gender pay gap, but the equality of pay, same work, same pay, that sort of thing. I'll get to some of their solutions. But more crucially, I'd like to poke your brain with how this is seen culturally, how we discriminate or how we have implicit bias, in our culture and how this translates into work. So in subsequent seminars, we'll look at different forms of leadership and how integrating more women into leadership has shifted the meaning of leadership. But here's what the report says. There's no one cause for the gap. This is on page 5. Important factors are discrimination, undervaluing roles predominantly done by women, dominance of men in best paid positions, and unequal caring responsibilities. Now, when you hear that list, which of those do you think is culturally informed versus policy informed? Which of those do you think is just a matter of practice, business practice? And those lines are important to think about because when we want to think about change, we also want to think about where is it important to focus our efforts towards change. Certainly, the cultural movements of late have driven a focus on sexual harassment at work. We think about the Me Too movement. This was Hollywood women coming out about their experiences of the casting couch. We've had the term casting couch for as long as we've had film on video, film on, reel, but we have only in this era come out as a society about its uneven distribution of work, sexual labor that is expected to be performed by women. Subsequent to the Me Too movement, Hollywood women created a fund and campaign to invest in women, working class women, being able to find legal defense or information for their own plights at work. Remember that as a woman of greater wealth or power, you may have more options in work, but poor women may not have the option to say, hey, I'm going to leave this job or out this boss or even confront my manager who's harassing me. So they created the Time's Up campaign, and this has effectively provided a legal defense, public voice, and public face for women across the income spectrum in many parts of the world to confront sexual harassment, but not only sexual harassment, but this movement piggybacked on the gender pay gap that the Fawcett Society had already brought to public purview. What all these things have in common, sexual harassment, equal pay, we're talking about fairness. So we really are just talking about the triple bottom line. Now, this has required business reporting magazines such as The Economist to constantly report about the gender pay gap. They do this in two important ways because as a news magazine that is called The Economist and focuses on the economy, they have the tendency to both offer cultural analysis because they acknowledge that culture, the S part of the pastoral analysis, has a huge influence on what businesses do, and know where is this greater seen than looking at raising awareness of gender discrimination in the workplace. But because they report on culture and they have special editions like these to here that specifically focus on culture and what to do with all the money that you have, there's lots of luxury advertising in here, they often contradict themselves. And this is where we find contradiction both in how we respond to our awareness of gender inequality. So for example, when I raise the issue of women make up 80% of care and leisure workers and only 8% of those working in better paid skilled trades, my students often say, well, those are personal choices. An individual chooses to go into engineering, which is extremely high paid, versus a care, being an RN, being a registered nurse, or even just a care provider, which is dominated by women. But we see that even if you dig into the data, of course, it talks about apprenticeships for some of these highly skilled, highly paid opportunities. And looking at engineering, you have only, very few women who go into engineering apprenticeship. So even in our pipeline to higher paid work, there are implicit forms of discrimination that exclude women all along the way, that we can't just say are up to personal choice. We have to acknowledge this. Lastly, I'd like to look at one way those personal choices are informed and sustained, because we often say, is it a choice? Like marriage. Now, the marriage market is huge, and there's an article in this publication about this, and it talks about the price itself of marriage, and it's gone up. The market itself is huge just in America. In fact, it's so big in America that Americans spent $56.2 billion last year on ceremonies, more than the annual GDP of half the countries of the world, on just getting hitched. And of course, the conclusion of the article, I'll just jump to that. There was a study in 2014, an American study of weddings in America, that said that among newlyweds of similar income, education, and race, those with flashier, more expensive weddings were more likely to get divorced. Money can't buy you love is the punchline. And the biggest expense in weddings is food. Now, weddings are a global trend. If you go to India, China as well, you'll find huge amounts of money spent on huge weddings that bring in everyone, which brings us back to this woman's wedding, which was hugely covered around the world. Now, I didn't think much of this when I first saw it, but my students pointed this out that, quote, she looks like she just copulated. I I tried to say that in the least vulgar way, but this was their analysis. And this is in a sense a projection of her power as a person versus his in another edition. But still, we sexualize women's bodies. So even in her position, what she does as a professional, as an actress, and who she now is representing the royal family, her body is still sexualized, normalized. Here, man and child. He's a father, and if you look at the subsequent pages of this magazine, you'll see there's just a focus on women's watch, diamonds. Her worth is this. The next page, this is a young couple, snapping young couple. So they have young couples, a happening young couple in all of the advertisements. And this is what we get to see. But ultimately, to have that, this is what the man will be doing, working, spending most of his time so he can afford to give his kids this stuff. Meanwhile, as the report from the Fawcett Society says, she is the one who carry the burden, the responsibility, while he is off saving the world. Now, these are implicit messages, same company, as a matter of fact, in the Mega Watch. Look how much a wedding costs. How much does the engagement ring cost? This is ultimately the goal. What pop culture and even the article here talks about the role that film and popular culture play in just portraying the idea of the normative family to sell any product, but it also is how we think about men and women at work. These studies also reinforce what we see here, that there is an implicit cultural value for women in care, for women as the more empathetic versus men as the more aggressive, assertive. Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook, recently said this, and she's reiterated this throughout her career, also as a publisher, that little girls are even socialized to hear their leadership as bossy. She often does this in a crowd. Raise your hand if you've been called bossy at work. And she asks the men, and there are a few often who raise their hand. But women, overwhelmingly, the women have been called too aggressive. And they've heard this since they were girls, versus leadership for boys is encouraged. Boys will be boys. Boys will be aggressive, assertive. And so we carry those implicit values that we learn at home to the workplace. And this means that in one TED Talk, she spoke about how, not a TED Talk, it was the talk at Davos, along with Carlos Ghosn and a few other global leaders. And she said that in one study, 64% of American managers, men, were afraid to be alone in the room with a woman colleague, meant that they couldn't mentor them. They couldn't spend social free time getting to know younger subordinates so that they could mentor them and raise them to the level of leadership. Excluded implicitly. Hillary Clinton in her campaign talks about this, how women are asked, how do you balance this? How do you do this? Sheryl Sandberg does this crowd poll every time she speaks as well. How do you balance? How do you do it all? Men aren't asked that question because men are expected, as the article shows, even to have all of this stuff, you're expected to be off saving capitalism. So what do we do about it? How do companies redress this? How do companies and families achieve a healthier work-life balance? Values at work, values at home. We'll speak about it. Be the change.